In this video essay concerning director Peter Jackson's 2002 fantasy epic The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and Guillermo del Toro's 2006 film Pan's Labyrinth, I will explore how both conform to and in many cases epitomize the conventions of the fantasy genre, through the concepts of the battle between good and evil, as well as the threat of temptation. To illustrate these concepts in both films, Jackson and del Toro utilized the mise-en-scène elements of set and prop design, camera proxemics, and color and lighting, as well as visual metaphors. Set on the fictional continent of Middle-earth, The Fellowship of the Ring follows a young hobbit named Frodo, who takes on the monumental task of destroying the One Ring, an artifact of incredible power which, if allowed to return to its maker, would bring the end of the world as he knows it. Pan's Labyrinth follows Ophelia, a young Spanish girl whose introduction to a mythical creature leads to her learning that she is the mortal reincarnation of a long-lost princess. In order to return to the magical underworld, she must complete a series of trials and face off against horrific monsters. Most fans would agree that Jackson brilliantly adapted the works of J.R.R. Tolkien from page to screen, and in doing so preserved not only the themes within, but the historical and political cultural context that the original author was influenced by. In the case of Tolkien, he was British, and he wrote The Lord of the Rings before, during, and after the Second World War. As such, while The Lord of the Rings does present a fantastical war taking place in a world different from our own, its conflict is grounded in the values that were born of the 20th century. It is common for characters in the film to refer to the times they face as dark, a specific term often used in the time period to describe World War II. Many characters of varying races are forced to put aside their differences, which in truth there are far fewer of than they might like to believe, and unite to combat the greater evil, echoing the fundamental reason for the formation of the Allied powers. In Middle-earth, this evil is the Dark Lord Sauron and his vile host. Much like the threat the Allies faced at the time of this villain's creation, he sees himself as deserving of absolute power, a vain and hateful being who desires to reshape the world in his own twisted image. In the film, Sauron's armor is extravagant and domineering in its design, achieving an effect similar to outfits produced by the fascist governments of Germany, Italy, and Spain. The elegant metalwork etched into his gauntlets speaks to his respect of some form of beauty, although his perception of such a concept is warped and demented. His vision of a perfect world is one where he is the master of every living creature, for the most terrifying of villains are never the ones who recognize the monsters that they have become.
Do you know how the orcs first came into being? They were elves once. Taken by the dark powers. Tortured and mutilated. A ruined and terrible form of life.
Despite appearing on the surface level as nothing but reprehensible beasts, it is through the orcs that we are reminded that no matter the necessary evil one has to vanquish, at the core of every one of its facilitators is another intelligent being, be they warped by dark magic or simply by the hatred of a loathsome ideologue. They outwardly reflect the corruption that exists within any being capable of committing the atrocities seen in World War II. As opposed to bringing a fictional world to life that was influenced by our own, Del Toro grounded his story strongly in our own reality, incorporating elements of magic naturally through the imaginative eyes of his main character. He too reached back to the early 40s to achieve this, particularly to Francoist Spain. Not only is the fight against the fascist threat literally shown between Spanish freedom fighters and Francoist troops led by the horrifying Captain Vidal in the film's secondary storyline, but all aspects of Spain's plight under the fascist regime are represented by the mythical creatures Ophelia encounters during her trials. Ophelia's first task is to retrieve a key from the belly of a massive toad which lives beneath an ancient fig tree. The tree is described as having once been a beautiful and bountiful thing, now rendered decrepit by the overindulgent amphibian that has invaded its ecosystem.
¿No te da vergüenza estar aquí abajo, comiéndote los bichitos y engordando mientras el árbol se muere?
A gluttonous creature, the toad endlessly consumes insects that the tree relies on for its survival at the expense of the tree's life. The toad has no respect for its home. This is an allegory for the behavior of the fascist gentry as displayed in the following scene, who feast on an embarrassingly large amount of food at Vidal's dinner party while discussing limiting rations for the lower classes of society. They indulge themselves at the expense of Spain and have no regard for the suffering they cause. Ophelia's second task sees her infiltrate the lair of one of Del Toro's most famous creations, the Pale Man, who he says represents all institutionalized evil. On a smaller scale, I would argue that he and the Captain are direct parallels in the fantasy and real worlds Ophelia inhabits. Much like the Pale Man, the Captain is seen before a sumptuous banquet. His position directly reflects that of the Pale Man, who chooses to find nourishment and a great deal of satisfaction through devouring innocence. Captain Vidal displays what can only be described as a demented pleasure from doing something very similar earlier in the film, abusing innocence for his own enjoyment. So, our evils are established. Vanity, gluttony, tyranny, repression, sadism, all accompaniments to a fascist regime, hence their role in the stories of these films. One might wonder what chance our small heroes stand against such intimidating foes. In a good story, the answer is that they are too often at the mercy of the forces of evil, and as a result, every hero must at some point in their journey come head-to-head with temptation.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Would you like to see your mother and father again? Together, we can bring them back.
In The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson represents the longing both Frodo and other members of the Fellowship begin to develop for the ring through the use of close-ups. Not being of unbreakable will, Frodo is often tempted to wear the ring himself, as it calls to him and those around him. And this degradation of the will is progressively represented through Andrew Lesnie's camera work. He is forced to see his friend Boromir falter and fail in the face of the Ring of Power, and falls into its trap by becoming not only its escort, but its guardian and protector, developing a relationship with it that he should not. In Pan's Labyrinth, similar tactics are used to represent Ophelia's desire to take a grape from the Pale Man's table. Despite warnings from their mentor figures, both characters give in, learning their lessons for doing so, but at great personal cost.
Never put it on, for the agents of the Dark Lord will be drawn to its power. Veréis. Oso banquete. No comáis, ni bebáis. Nada. Always remember, Frodo. The ring is trying to get back to its master. Absolutamente nada.
The similarities between the two films and how they execute their narratives are numerous. However, it is through their use of color and lighting that their differences are highlighted. In The Lord of the Rings, the classical fantasy relationship between darkness representing evil and light representing good is perpetuated. Sauron's domain of Mordor is ashen and bleak, the sun blocked out so that his minions can remain blanketed in a comforting veil of shadow. Gandalf, both Frodo's and the Fellowship's guide, is wary to enter the sprawling underground mining city of Moria, because he knows that in the deep places of their world, nothing good awaits them.
We now have but one choice. We must face the long dark of Moria.
The only light that isn't emitted from the murderous Balrog is that which Gandalf brought with him, and it is their only hope in the darkness. In Pan's Labyrinth, Del Toro challenges this stereotype, using blues and low-key lighting to represent the underworld and its people, as well as Ophelia. Where the night proves a danger to Frodo and his friends, it is a sanctuary for Ophelia, for it is under the cover of moonlight that the lost princess is able to unite with her guide, the Faun. Rooms filled with warm orange light are constantly used to represent her enemies and danger, signaling to the audience that hearths and tables full of food don't always mean comfort and goodwill. They can be guises for the many evils of our world. This stark contrast illustrated by the mise-en-scène is perhaps the greatest example of how the cultural context of these films actually differed. The black and white presentation of good and evil represented by The Lord of the Rings is synonymous with the 20th century's more straightforward depiction of such ideas, and as Jackson pulled directly from source material written in that era, set representations were preserved. Del Toro worked a slightly more complex angle in this regard, one that is relevant to the more cynical and inquisitive 21st century. Peter Jackson and Guillermo del Toro both express their stories through the use of the mise-en-scène and visual metaphor, conforming to defined fantasy ideas like the battle between good and evil as well as the threat of temptation. while also incorporating their own creative concepts and ideas to produce some of the most memorable and impactful films ever contributed to the fantasy genre.